In my first video on Chaucer's Prioress, I deconstructed the elegant Madame Eglantyne to reveal the satirical portrayal of a Benedictine nun who has broken all the vows of her conventual order. Once we know what we're looking for, it's clear that everything about her, her table manners, her dogs, her French, her gold brooch, her name, every detail is dripping with irony. But what really interests me is the fact that from around the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 20th, most readers of Chaucer seem not to have known what they were looking for. They took Chaucer's description of the prioress at face value, not realising that it was ironic. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video, how generations of readers simply missed something that would have been obvious in the 14th century. The story breaks down into 5 main parts. The first is the disappearance of Chaucer's world after the Reformation of the 16th century. The people Chaucer wrote about, monks and nuns and pardoners and so on, no longer populated the landscape, so the early moderns no longer had day-to-day familiarity with the norms of his society. And the second is the recasting of Chaucer during the early modern period as some kind of proto-Protestant, complete with the false attribution to him of a couple of Lollard reformist texts. The third is the role played by translations of Chaucer from Middle English into more up-to-date language, and I'll be taking a particularly close look at one of those translations, which I think scholars so far haven't really given enough attention to. And the fourth is Gothic Romanticism, which saw the medieval world as a simple, jolly society characterised by sincerity and purity. And the fifth is the hypocrisy hardwired into Victorian society. By the 19th century, the qualities that Chaucer satirises in the prioress had, quite simply, become the accepted characteristics of a virtuous person. The fourth and fifth steps are fairly well known, as is the story of how the ironies were recovered by 20th century scholarship, so I'm mainly focusing on the first 3 steps here. For the full Monty, covering all 5 steps in detail, check out my digital book on the subject. Chaucer finished the Canterbury Tales sometime in the 1390s. Nearly a century and a half later, in 1536, Henry VIII embarked on the closure of the monasteries in England and Wales. By 1541, not a single monastery, friary or convent remained. Their libraries had been broken up or destroyed and their inhabitants scattered. An institution that had been part of English life for nearly 1,000 years ceased to exist within a decade. The memory of how life used to be survived for a while, but by the end of the 16th century, most English people had never seen a nun or a monk. That world had receded into history, or lands across the sea that still paid allegiance to the Pope. At the same time, Chaucer was being claimed as a supporter of the reformist cause. The newly established Protestant religion needed its own books and libraries to replace the Catholic ones that had been destroyed. That's a topic in its own right, and I'll come back to it in another video. But the upshot is that Chaucer was recast as an early reformer. Chaucer's womanising friar, his fraudulent pardoner, and other characters were not, in his intent, a criticism of the Church, but an admonishment to his readers to be better Catholics. After the Reformation, though, his satire, it was still perceived as satire, but it was increasingly viewed as an attack on the Catholic Church, rather than on individuals who failed to live up to the ideals of the Church. Now, this reading of Chaucer was strengthened by the false attribution to Chaucer of a couple of writings by Lollards, followers of Wycliffe, who anticipated the Protestant Reformation with their hostility towards the Church in the 14th century. The first misattribution was in 1532, when a prose work called the Testament of Love was published in an edition of Chaucer's collected works. This was an allegorical text actually written by a man named Thomas Uske, who was executed for treason in 1388. Then, in 1542, a second edition of Chaucer's works was published, adding a poem called The Ploughman's Tale, a fiercely anti-clerical work by an unknown author. Chaucer had nothing to do with either of these texts, but once his name was associated with him, there was no looking back. John Foxe, in the 1570 edition of his Acts and Monuments, better known as the Book of Martyrs, cited these texts as proof that Chaucer was, in his phrase, a right Wyclivian, that is, a follower of John Wycliffe, an enemy of Catholicism, a Protestant in all but name. Foxe also falsely attributed another anti-clerical work, the anonymous Jack Upland, to Chaucer.
As Chaucer said, "I never said that!"
Sorry, mate. I've got a propaganda war to win here.
Thomas Speght, who edited Chaucer's works in the late 16th century, even invented a mythical life for Chaucer, a life in which he was a student at Merton College, Oxford, alongside Wycliffe himself, whose religious opinions he was said to have much affected, and to have suffered wrongful imprisonment after backing a popular revolt. Later biographers stitched these threads together into a full-blown tale of Lollard rebellion, exile, betrayal by his fellow exiles, and imprisonment in the Tower of London, where he, in turn, betrayed his former comrades as the price of freedom. There was no truth in any of it, but when did that ever stop people from believing things? Bit by bit, as Chaucer's world receded into history and Protestants sought to claim him as one of their own, the real Chaucer was slowly buried under misconceptions. Fast forward now to the 18th century, where we find John Dryden, himself a convert to Catholicism, swallowing the fabrication that Chaucer had some little bias towards the opinions of Wycliffe, while at the same time being perceptive enough to see that his satire was directed at bad priests, not at the church itself. Dryden appreciates Chaucer's satirical attacks on religious hypocrites, commenting, "Their pride, their ambition, their pomp, their avarice, their worldly interest deserved the lashes which he gave them." And he explicitly sees the irony in Chaucer's portrayal of what he calls the mincing lady prioress. But in his own translation of Chaucer for a more modern readership, he omits all of it, including the prioress, perhaps because, as a Catholic, he doesn't want to feed into an anti-Catholic narrative. George Ogle, too, in his 1741 edition of translated extracts from the Canterbury Tales, placed Chaucer, as Brucey Carver points out, in a comic satiric tradition, saying, "You can name no author, even of antiquity, whether in the comic or in the satiric way, equal to Chaucer." And in a later work, he cites the portrayal of the prioress weeping if she saw a mouse caught in a trap as an example of Chaucer's comic and satiric genius. Clearly, Ogle got it. Curiously, though, the translator of the description of the prioress, whose work is included in Ogle's 1741 edition, did not get it, or at least did not choose to show it. The passage in question, published in the name of Thomas Betterton, but generally accepted as being an early work by Alexander Pope, presents Chaucer's Prioress straight, without a hint of irony. It's too long to quote in full here, but a few lines will give the general idea. With a becoming grace and smiling eye, she gained respect from all the company. Easy and free, still pleasant at her meat, and held it no small pain to counterfeit. She hated stateliness, yet wisely knew what fit regard was to her title due. She pitied every creature in distress, devout and charitable to excess. Her tender heart with such compassion filled, she'd weep to see a poor mouse caught and killed. There's no ironic undercurrent here. The tension between the prioress's supposed spiritual calling and her earthly ambitions and trivial sentimentality is lost in Pope's portrayal of her as both pious and elegant, compassionate and esteemed. So what happened? Did Pope miss the irony entirely? I doubt it. We can perhaps pick up a hint here from his treatment of the monk, the friar and the pardoner. Under Pope's pen, these characters also lose their ironic undertones, but in a very different way. Where Chaucer hints at hypocrisy in these characters, Pope makes it explicit. Take the monk, where Chaucer uses implication. A monk there was, a fair for the maestry, an outrider that loved venery, a manly man to be in an abbot able. Full many a dainty horse had he in stable. Pope goes for parody. Next there a merry monk appears in place, who followed hunting more than saying mass, as bravely mounted as a lord from court. No well-fed abbot bore a comelier port. There's nothing for the reader to infer here. Pope spells it out. Where Chaucer leaves the reader to bridge the gap between what the monk is and what he ought to be, Pope says it directly. He followed hunting more than saying mass. It's the same with the friar and the pardoner. I won't go into it all here. Check out the digital book on my website if you want the full details. The point, though, is that at the same time as whitewashing the prioress, Pope villainises the other religious hypocrites. But why? Pope, like Dryden, was a Catholic. He was also a consummate master of satire. He probably made this translation when he was about 20 years old, having pored over Chaucer since the age of 13, and just 3 or 4 years before he penned The Rape of the Lock. It seems unlikely that Pope simply missed the satire in the description of the prioress. It's far more likely, to my mind at least, that he saw it and chose to suppress it. The other characters, the monk, the friar and the pardoner, were unmistakably flawed, but the prioress's vanities and sentimental weaknesses were conformable with Protestant ideals. So my take on this is that Pope, as a Catholic, sanitised the prioress as a way of sidestepping the issue. He gambled, if you like, on the Protestant mainstream accepting the prioress as a paragon of virtue. And he won. For the next 200 years, most readers saw the prioress through the same rose-tinted lens. This matters because George Ogle's edition of Chaucer was a popular modernisation aimed at general readers. The prioress that most 18th century readers encountered was Pope's prioress, not Chaucer's. I don't think modern scholarship has given proper weight to Pope's translation. Critics tend to talk in more general terms about how romantic medievalism painted an idealised fiction of the Middle Ages, and how Victorian society had so far conflated honest piety with the hypocritical performance of piety that the two were no longer separable, making the prioress's religious calling perfectly conformable with her earthly ambitions and trite sentimentality. I wouldn't want to say that there's anything wrong with looking at things in that kind of way. The loss of irony in the portrayal of the prioress is certainly part of a bigger picture of an idealised, romanticised medieval world that only existed in the minds of sentimentalists and escapists. But the role played by Dryden, and more particularly Pope, the one simply by omitting Chaucer's satirical portraits of religious hypocrites, and the other by twisting them into parody or whitewash, has generally been overlooked. These two Catholic writers were not merely translating Chaucer, they were doing a PR job on him, packaging his medieval Catholic world for a Protestant readership, and framing the text in ways that moulded the perceptions of readers for generations to come. I go into all of this in a lot more detail in the digital book on my Educational Hub website. If you want those details, clicking on the link in the comments is your next step. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in more poetry videos, I've made hundreds of them. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications for new stuff, and check the playlists for evergreen oldies. If you want even more material, visit my Educational Hub website.